Picture this, Doug Ford, standing at a podium somewhere in Ontario, telling the Prime Minister of Canada how to negotiate with the world's second-largest economy. And before you think this is just another day in Canadian politics, remember that this is the same Doug Ford who threatened to ban Crown Royal over a bottling plant closure. Now he's giving foreign policy advice to Mark Carney about Chinese electric vehicles. Welcome back to Canadian Insights, where Canadian politics is never boring and premiers apparently moonlight as trade negotiators. Today we're unpacking Ford's warning to Carney about keeping tariffs on Chinese EVs as the PM prepares to visit Beijing. And trust me, this is way more complicated than it sounds. Buckle up, because we're about to dive into tariffs, trade wars, angry farmers, and the eternal question: can Canada actually have a coherent foreign policy when provinces keep yelling conflicting advice? So let's set the stage here. Mark Carney, our relatively new Prime Minister, is heading to China next week. Trade is going to be a major topic of conversation, which makes sense because Canada and China have been in what I'd call a complicated relationship status for years now. And right before Carney hops on that plane, Doug Ford decides to hold a press conference and essentially tell the PM, "Hey buddy, don't you dare touch those tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. We need them. Ontario needs them. Don't back down." Ford's exact words were, "We can't back down." Simple as that. Which is a very Ford way of summarizing an incredibly complex international trade situation. Simple as that. Sure, Doug. International trade policy with a nuclear-armed superpower. Simple stuff. Now, to understand why Ford is so fired up about this, we need to rewind a bit. Canada didn't just wake up one day and decide to slap a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs for fun. This happened because the previous US administration under Joe Biden did it first, and Canada decided to move in lockstep with the Americans. The reasoning was that these tariffs were necessary to protect Canada's domestic automobile industry from cheap Chinese electric vehicles flooding the market. And when I say 100% tariff, I mean if a Chinese EV costs $20,000, you're now paying $40,000. That's not a small bump. That's a "we really don't want you buying these" level of tariff. Here's where it gets spicy. China, unsurprisingly, was not thrilled about this. They did what countries do when you slap tariffs on their stuff: they retaliated. And they went straight for the throat of Canada's agricultural sector. China slapped tariffs on canola, seafood, and pork. 3 massive Canadian exports. We're talking billions of dollars in trade and thousands of jobs, mostly concentrated in the prairies. Farmers in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta are getting hammered because their products are now way more expensive in one of their biggest markets. So basically, Ontario's auto industry got protection, and prairie farmers got punished. You can see where this might create some tension. And that tension is exactly what's been building. The prairie premiers have been putting massive pressure on Ottawa to lift those EV tariffs so China will hopefully back off and remove their retaliatory tariffs on agriculture. These premiers are looking at farmers who can't sell their canola, fishermen who can't move their seafood, and pork producers watching their export markets disappear. From their perspective, protecting Ontario's auto jobs by destroying prairie agriculture jobs is a pretty terrible trade-off. They want relief. They want those tariffs gone. They want their farmers back in business. But then you've got Doug Ford on the other side, and he's basically planting himself in front of Ontario's auto industry like a bouncer at an exclusive club. Ford's message is crystal clear: these tariffs stay. He's not budging. During his press conference Thursday, he laid out his position in classic Ford fashion. He said if Chinese companies want to sell EVs in Canada, they should come here and open a big manufacturing facility and employ Unifor employees. Unifor is the auto workers union, for those keeping track. Then Ford added, but don't be shipping cars and not manufactured by Ontarians. So his position is basically, you want access to our market? Build here. Employ our people. Otherwise, keep your cheap EVs across the Pacific. Now, from Ford's perspective, this makes complete sense. Ontario's auto industry is massive. It's thousands of jobs, billions in economic activity, and it's been part of Ontario's industrial identity for over a century. The last thing Ford wants is to see that industry gutted by cheap imports. He's watched manufacturing jobs disappear to other countries for decades, and is determined not to let it happen with EVs. So when he tells Carney not to back down on these tariffs, he's fighting for his province's economic lifeblood. That's his job as Premier. That's what he was elected to do. But here's the problem. Carney isn't just the Premier of Ontario. He's the Prime Minister of Canada. Which means he's supposed to represent all provinces, all industries, all Canadians. And right now, What's good for Ontario auto workers might be terrible for prairie farmers. It's the classic Canadian regional tension that's been with us since Confederation. What helps one region hurts another, and the federal government is stuck in the middle trying to keep everyone happy, which is basically impossible. So Carney is heading to Beijing with this massive conflict hanging over his head. He's got Ford yelling don't touch the tariffs while prairie premiers are yelling kill the tariffs immediately. He's got auto workers on one side and farmers on the other. He's got one of Canada's most important trading relationships in tatters, and he's supposed to somehow thread the needle and fix this. No pressure, Mark. Just casual stuff. Simple as that, right? Let's talk about what's actually at stake here, because this isn't just about cars and canola. This is about Canada's entire approach to trade with China and, more broadly, our relationship with the world's second-largest economy. China is a massive market. Over 1 billion people. Growing middle class. Huge demand for resources, food, manufactured goods. Canadian businesses have been salivating over Chinese market access for decades. But China is also increasingly assertive, sometimes aggressive, and willing to use trade as a weapon when countries displease them. We've seen this before with the two Michaels, with canola bans, with various trade irritants over the years. The question Canada faces is, do we stand up to China and accept the economic pain, or do we try to accommodate them to keep trade flowing? And there's no easy answer. If we cave on the EV tariffs, we might save prairie agriculture but gut Ontario manufacturing. If we hold firm, we protect auto jobs but watch farmers suffer. And beyond the immediate economics, there's the signal we send. Do we let China dictate our trade policy through retaliation? Do we show other countries that threatening Canadian industries is an effective way to change our behavior? These are the questions that keep trade negotiators and prime ministers up at night. Ford's position is that we absolutely cannot cave. He's basically saying that giving in to Chinese pressure sets a terrible precedent and abandons Ontario workers. And look, there's something to that argument. If Canada backs down every time China retaliates against our trade measures, then we effectively have no control over our own trade policy. We become reactive instead of proactive. We let Beijing call the shots. That's a legitimate concern, especially for a country like Canada that depends on trade but also wants to maintain sovereignty over its economic decisions. But the prairie premiers would tell you that's easy for Ford to say when it's not his constituents losing their farms and their livelihoods. They'd argue that starting this trade fight with China in the first place was a mistake, that we got dragged into it by American policy that doesn't necessarily serve Canadian interests, and that now Canadian farmers are paying the price for a trade war they never asked for. They'd say that Ford is willing to sacrifice prairie agriculture to protect Ontario auto jobs, and that's not fair, it's not right, and it's not what Confederation is supposed to be about. And here's the really frustrating part for anyone trying to understand the situation, they're both kind of right. Ford is right that protecting domestic industry from unfair competition matters. The prairie premiers are right that you can't sacrifice one region's economy to protect another's. Carney is stuck between two legitimate positions with no obvious solution that makes everyone happy. This also raises bigger questions about Canada's trade strategy in general. We moved in lockstep with Biden on these EV tariffs, but Biden's administration is gone and US policy might shift. Are we still in lockstep? Do we have our own independent position? What happens if American policy changes and suddenly we're out there alone facing Chinese retaliation? These are the strategic questions that should have been answered before we slapped on 100% tariffs, but here we are. Ford mentioned during his press conference that Chinese companies would be welcome if they built manufacturing facilities here and employed Canadian workers. That's actually not a crazy idea. We've seen foreign auto manufacturers do exactly this. Toyota, Honda, and others have major facilities in Ontario employing thousands of Canadians. If Chinese EV makers want market access, having them build here creates jobs, generates tax revenue, and gives us more leverage. But getting China to agree to that while they're currently mad at us and retaliating against our agriculture? Good luck with those negotiations, PM Carney. What's also interesting is the timing of all this. Carney is trying to repair ties with Beijing. That's literally in the description of this trip. He's going there to smooth things over, to get the relationship back on track, to find some common ground. And right before he leaves, one of Canada's most prominent premiers goes on television and basically says don't give them anything. That's not exactly helpful when you're trying to rebuild a relationship. It's like trying to apologize to someone while your friend stands behind you yelling, don't back down. It makes negotiation a bit more complicated. The reality is that Canada's relationship with China is going to be complicated no matter what Carney does in Beijing. We have deep economic ties but also significant political and strategic differences. We want their market access but don't want to compromise our values or sovereignty. We want to protect Canadian industries but also need to export to them. These tensions don't have easy solutions, and they are certainly not going to be resolved by a single trip or a single decision about EV tariffs. What this whole situation really reveals is how challenging it is to manage trade policy in a federation like Canada. The federal government makes these decisions, but provinces bear the consequences differently depending on their economic makeup. Ford cares about auto manufacturing because that's Ontario's strength. Prairie premiers care about agriculture because that's their economic base. Carney has to somehow balance these competing interests while also managing international relationships and maintaining Canada's credibility as a trading nation. It's a juggling act that would challenge anyone. So what happens next? Carney goes to Beijing next week. He sits down with Chinese officials. Trade will definitely be on the table. And he's got to figure out if there's any path forward that doesn't completely alienate either Ontario or the prairies. Maybe he finds some middle ground. Maybe China offers to partially lift agriculture tariffs if Canada makes some concessions elsewhere. Maybe nothing changes and we're stuck in this stalemate. We'll find out soon enough. If you're enjoying this breakdown of Canada's trade drama, smash that like button and subscribe to Canadian Insights. We're covering Canadian politics multiple times every day, giving you the analysis and context you need to understand what's actually happening in Ottawa and across the country. Drop a comment and let me know what you think Carney should do. Should he listen to Ford and hold the line on EV tariffs? Should he prioritize prairie agriculture and cut a deal with China? Is there a creative solution we're all missing? Let's discuss. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one where we'll keep breaking down the chaos that is Canadian politics. Stay sharp, stay informed, and remember that in Canadian politics, simple is never actually simple. See you next time.